the cry of a baby carried across the empty alleyway, thin and fragile, swallowed quickly by the evening wind. Just beyond the cracked concrete, tied cruelly to a rusted chain link fence, a German shepherd stirred. His ribs pressed sharp against his dull coat, eyes sunken yet flickering with something unbroken. Hope, faint as an ember. The baby, barely able to crawl, had somehow wandered from the small back porch, where his family thought he slept. He pressed a chubby hand to the cold dirt, cooing curiously toward the shadow of the dog. The shepherd raised his head, ears twitching, and let out the faintest whine. Not of menace, but of longing. In that moment, two souls, one at the very start of life, the other on the edge of losing it, locked eyes. The baby gurgled and giggled, as if unafraid, as if already knowing this creature was not danger but kin. And the shepherd, though starved and bound, lowered his head gently to the ground, as though bowing to the fragile miracle before him. It was the beginning of a bond no chain could hold. A bond that would soon be tested by fear, fire, and the edge of survival itself. The morning sun crept timidly through the thin curtains, painting the living room in pale streaks of gold. The baby, now bundled into a soft blue onesie, sat on the carpet surrounded by scattered wooden blocks. His tiny fingers grasped at one block, then another, the world still a mystery waiting to be arranged in his own rhythm. Just a few feet away, the dog, thin, bruised, and bandaged, rested on an old blanket laid out by the mother. The German shepherd lifted his head each time the baby babbled. His ears, though drooping from exhaustion, pricked at the sound like bells ringing in the fog. The child's laughter was faint and incomplete, the way infants laugh when they've only just learned what joy feels like. And yet, it seemed enough to bring life back into the dog's hollow eyes. The mother watched carefully from the couch, her arms folded. The night had been long. She had checked the dog's breathing more than once, fearing his body was too weak to survive. She told herself over and over, we should call the shelter. We should let them take him. But something stopped her. Something in the way her baby looked at that animal, as if the two had spoken in a language she couldn't understand. That morning, when the baby toppled over clumsily onto the dog's blanket, there was a moment of suspended breath. The mother froze, instinctively half rising from her seat. The German shepherd's nose twitched. Slowly, with almost ceremonial grace, he pressed his head forward, resting his muzzle gently against the child's tiny arm. The baby giggled, the sound bubbling like spring water breaking through ice. It was the first break in the silence that had weighed on the house. Later that day, the father came home from his shift. He was a man worn by long hours and the weight of responsibility, his uniform still smelling faintly of diesel and cold air. He wasn't prepared for the sight that greeted him, his son, curled up beside the gaunt animal, fingers tangled in coarse fur. He set his bag down slowly. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low, not angry but cautious. The mother explained how she had found the dog, how weak he'd been, how their baby had refused to leave his side. She expected resistance, maybe even frustration. Instead, the father crouched near the blanket. He studied the shepherd's trembling ribs, the way the animal didn't flinch despite a stranger kneeling so close. His rough, calloused hand hovered just above the dog's head before lowering gently. The shepherd closed his eyes, as if in trust. The father sighed. "His broken," he said softly, "but not gone. It was the second break, the kind that shatters barriers rather than bonds." That evening, after dinner dishes clinked in the sink, the family gathered in the living room. The father brought out a shallow bowl of rice and chicken scraps, kneeling as though serving a guest of honor. The shepherd ate slowly, painfully, his teeth clicking against the porcelain as he struggled not to devour too fast. The baby watched, wide-eyed, as if the ritual of feeding was sacred. When the bowl was empty, the dog lifted his head and looked around the room. His eyes, no longer just hollow pools, carried a spark. It was faint, but it was there. The mother leaned back and whispered, "Maybe he came here for a reason." The father didn't answer, but his gaze lingered on his son and the dog, two fragile souls tethered together by invisible thread. That night, the house was quiet, but not the silence of loneliness. The baby stirred in his crib, murmuring in half syllables that made no sense but carried comfort. In the corner of the nursery, the German shepherd lay curled on the rug, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. Every so often, he would lift his head at the smallest sound, a creak in the wood, a shifting blanket, and check the crib before settling again. The bond was no longer silent. It had begun to speak. The first break was in the barrier of fear. The second was in the wall of hesitation. And somewhere in the fragile heartbeat of that home, a promise began to take shape. An unspoken vow that one day, when danger would come knocking, neither the baby nor the dog would face it alone. The winter wind rattled the window panes, carrying with it a low howl that echoed across the quiet street. Inside, the family's small home was dimly lit, the baby's soft toys scattered across the floor. The German shepherd lay nearby, his body thin but already stronger than it had been a week ago. The faintest layer of new muscle had begun to show beneath his fur. Yet, even in his healing, there was always tension in the way he carried himself. Ears twitching, body alert, eyes never fully at rest. The mother noticed it first, the way the shepherd would snap his head toward the door long before any knock came, or the way his body stiffened whenever footsteps echoed outside the house. At night, he sometimes paced, circling the baby's crib before lying down again, a soldier unwilling to lower his guard. It was not the behavior of a dog who felt safe. It was the behavior of one who knew danger was still close. One evening, as the baby played with a stuffed bear on the carpet, the shepherd stood suddenly, his tail stiff, ears locked forward. His nose quivered as he sniffed the air, a low growl beginning to hum in his throat. The baby paused, tiny hands frozen mid-motion, and looked up at his companion. His lips quivered, sensing the shift. The shepherd stepped closer, placing himself between the baby and the door, his body angled like a shield. The father, working at the kitchen table, noticed the change and followed the dog's stare. A shadow passed the frosted window. Not just a neighbor. Not a casual wanderer. Something lingered too long. He rose, quietly moving to the door, heart thudding with the instinct that something wasn't right. By the time he flung it open, the street was empty, just the wind curling dust along the curb. But the shepherd did not relax. His growl remained, rumbling like a storm caught under his ribs. The father shut the door firmly and muttered, "Someone was here." The days that followed were uneasy. Neighbors whispered about break-ins a few blocks away, homes forced open while families slept. Small items vanished first, tools, bags, bikes, then bigger things, electronics, cash, even a car. The shepherd's worriness made sense now. He was not paranoid. He was prepared. The mother tried to hide her fear, but each night she double-checked the locks, then placed the baby monitor closer to her pillow. The father insisted they would be fine, but his hand lingered longer than usual on the baseball bat he kept by the bed. Through it all, the shepherd became the house's lifeline. He slept less and patrolled more. At dusk, he positioned himself by the baby's crib, ears swiveling at every creak. At dawn, he followed the child's first giggles, tail wagging as if reassuring himself that all was still well. It was as though he had chosen his role, not as a guest, not even as a rescued stray, but as guardian. One night, the house fell into deep silence. The baby was asleep, arms splayed like wings across his blanket. The father snored faintly in the next room. And then, a sound, a scrape, metal against wood. The shepherd's eyes snapped open. His body stiffened, ears flicking toward the front door. Another scrape came, slower this time. A lock being tested, a hinge strained. The shepherd rose soundlessly, his paws careful against the floorboards. He positioned himself in front of the baby's crib and growled low, deep, a sound so primal it vibrated through the room. The baby stirred but did not cry, as though even in his half-sleep. He trusted that sound. The growl was not a warning to him, but for the danger outside. The father awoke to the noise, grabbed the bat, and hurried into the hall. The mother clutched the baby monitor, her breath shallow. Together they heard it, the rattle of the door handle, a forced push against the wood. The shepherd lunged forward, barking now, thunder exploding in the night. His teeth flashed, his body slammed against the door as if daring it to open. The sound on the other side stopped. Silence stretched. Then hurried footsteps retreated into the dark. The father swung the door open, bat raised. But the street was once again empty. Only the shepherd remained, still growling, staring into the shadows as though memorizing the scent of the intruder. When quiet finally returned, The father dropped to one knee, his hand resting firmly on the dog's neck. "You saved us," he whispered. The shepherd turned his head toward the nursery where the baby now slept peacefully, then back to the door as if to say, "Not us. Him." The weight of the moment sank into the family. This was no ordinary stray. He had come broken, tied to a fence, starving and abandoned. But here, in this fragile house, with a baby who had offered him unconditional trust, he had found something worth fighting for. And from that night on, the shepherd's bond with the child deepened. He no longer simply lay near the crib. He slept with his nose against the bars, his breath sensing with the baby's, a silent vow renewed with every rise and fall of their tiny chests. Safety was no longer something the family took for granted. It had become a pursuit. And in that pursuit, a starving shepherd and a fragile baby had become warriors of the same cause. The days after the attempted break, passed in a haze of unease. The father boarded the windows with extra locks. The mother whispered prayers as she tucked the baby in each night. And the shepherd never once let his guard down. He was more restless now, pacing the hallways as though waiting for the next shadow to appear. But what none of them expected was that the next threat would not come from the street or the front door. It would come from inside the very walls of their home. It began on a gray morning, rain pelting the glass with a steady rhythm. The mother was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, the baby babbling in his high chair, the shepherd sitting loyally by his side. Suddenly, the baby coughed, a sharp, wheezing sound. His small chest rose too quickly, his tiny hands flailing at the air. At first, the mother thought it was just a piece of cereal gone down the wrong way. She rushed to his side, patting his back. But then the baby's face turned a shade too pale, his lips trembling as he gasped for breath. The shepherd leapt up, barking urgently, his voice piercing, frantic. He spun toward the father, who was upstairs, his deep bark echoing through the house like an alarm. The father thundered down the stairs at the sound, his face blanching when he saw his son's struggling breaths. "He can't breathe," the mother cried, her voice breaking. The baby's chest heaved, eyes wide with panic. The shepherd pressed close, whining now, his head darting between the baby and the parents, as though demanding they act. His paws scratched against the floor, restless, helpless, yet so fiercely determined to hold the moment together. The father grabbed the baby, tilting him, patting his back harder, trying to remember the steps they'd read in the baby books. The baby coughed again, but the sound was weak, thready. Panic swelled in the room, thick as the storm pounding outside. And then, it happened. The baby's tiny body went limp in the father's arms, his breath so faint they were almost gone. The mother screamed, tears blurring her vision. "We need to get him to the hospital. Now!" But the shepherd didn't wait for debate. He bolted to the door, pawing at it wildly, barking so loud the walls seemed to shake. His eyes were on fire with urgency. He understood, he knew. The father, trembling, cradled the baby as they rushed into the storm. Rain lashed their faces, the car barely visible in the sheets of water. The shepherd leapt in beside them, pressing his body against the baby as though to anchor him to life itself. The drive was chaos, tires slipping, windshield wipers straining. The mother sobbing as she held the baby's hand, whispering desperate prayers. The shepherd lay across the seat, nose pressed to the child's chest, listening for every faint breath. When the baby's chest stilled too long, the shepherd licked his face, nudged him, whining frantically until a faint gasp came again. "Don't let him go!" the mother cried. "Please don't let him go!" Through the storm, the red glow of the hospital sign finally appeared. The father skidded the car into the emergency bay, leaping out with the baby clutched against his chest. Nurses swarmed, rushing them inside. The shepherd tried to follow, but a security guard held him back. The dog strained against the grip, growling, his eyes wild, desperate to stay with the child he had sworn to protect. Rain streamed down his muzzle, his body trembling with fear and fury at being left behind. But even as the doors closed, the baby's weak cry echoed through the hall. A sound fragile, but alive. Hours blurred. The family waited in a sterile hospital room, the baby hooked to machines, doctors explaining that it had been a sudden severe allergic reaction. One wrong bite, one hidden ingredient, and his airway had nearly collapsed. The mother sat by the bed, stroking her son's hair, whispering, "You're safe now. You're safe, my love." And then she looked at the shepherd, lying at the foot of the bed, finally allowed inside when he refused to leave the entrance. His eyes never left the baby. He hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. He simply stayed, a silent sentinel. When the doctor came in, he shook his head in quiet wonder. "You brought him just in time. Another few minutes?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The parents exchanged a glance heavy with unspoken terror. They had nearly lost him. But when their eyes fell to the shepherd, there was no mistaking the truth. It was his alarm, his urgency, his refusal to stay silent that had saved their baby. The father knelt, gripping the dog's head, his voice breaking. "You're not just a rescue. You're the reason our boy is alive." The shepherd leaned into his hand, eyes closing briefly, then returned his gaze to the baby's chest rising and falling, as though he would never forgive himself if he looked away. That night, as the storm cleared and silence settled over the hospital, the baby stirred in his sleep. His tiny hand reached out blindly. The shepherd moved closer, pressing his muzzle gently into that hand. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around the fur. The mother wept softly, her hand over her mouth, as she watched the bond between them made visible in that small, fragile touch. In that sterile, humming room filled with the echoes of near tragedy, something sacred had been forged. Not just relief. Not just safety, it was a vow. The shepherd would never again let harm come near this child. Not from the world outside, not from shadows at the door. Not even from the sudden betrayals of the body itself. He had found his purpose, and he would guard it with every heartbeat he had left. And though the baby could not yet speak, his small hand gripping that loyal muzzle said the words for him. "Stay. Don't leave me. You are my lifeline." The storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean, the streets glistening under pale morning light. But inside the hospital room, the family was still reeling from the night before. The baby slept more soundly now, color returning to his cheeks, his small chest rising and falling with steady rhythm. Every breath felt like a miracle, each one a reassurance that the nightmare had loosened its grip. The shepherd had not moved from his post at the foot of the bed. His eyes were heavy, but he fought the pull of sleep, unwilling to drift too far. When a nurse walked in, the shepherd's gaze followed her every movement, his ears twitching at the sound of footsteps, the faint clink of medical instruments. He was not hostile, just alert, a soldier stationed at the threshold of a fragile life. The mother leaned against the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee, watching the shepherd with quiet awe. "He doesn't even blink," she whispered. The father, sitting on the stiff plastic chair beside her, rubbed his temples. "He knows. He knows this boy is his job now." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the swell of emotion he tried to contain. The baby stirred, and the shepherd lifted his head immediately. A soft whimper escaped the child's lips, and the dog was at the bedside in an instant, nudging gently, licking the small hand that had begun to flail. The baby's fingers curled into the thick fur, gripping it like an anchor. The dog exhaled deeply, pressing closer, as if willing calm into that tiny body. The mother wiped her eyes. "It's like he can hear his heartbeat," she murmured. By the end of the second day, the baby was breathing on his own again. The machines were taken away, leaving only the sound of his soft breaths and occasional babbles. The shepherd finally allowed himself to rest, stretching out on the cool tile floor, his paws twitching as he drifted into uneasy dreams. But even in sleep, the moment the baby shifted, the dog's eyes snapped open, his ears tilted toward the sound, his body ready to rise. When they were finally discharged, the family stepped back into the sunlight, exhausted but relieved. The father carried the baby, the mother's arm looped around his waist, and the shepherd padded beside them, lean and still a little underfed, but strong with something deeper than muscle. Neighbors peered from porches as they passed, whispering, some shaking their heads. The dog's reputation had spread, the rescue shepherd who saved the baby's life. Some smiled with admiration, others with disbelief, but the family no longer cared for judgment. Their truth was enough. At home, the mother laid the baby in his crib, but he fussed, restless, until the shepherd entered the room. Only then did the baby quiet, his tiny eyes following the dog's every step. With a sigh, the mother placed the baby's blanket on the floor near the crib. The shepherd lay down on it, nose close enough to the bars that the baby could reach his hand through. That was all it took. The baby's fingers brushed fur, and sleep claimed him. The parents exchanged a look, a mixture of gratitude and surrender. They understood now. This was no ordinary companionship. This was survival bound in fur and flesh, heart and soul. Days bled into weeks, the routine shifting around the unspoken truth. The shepherd was no longer just part of the family. He was the axis around which their small world spun. He grew healthier with each passing day. His ribs, once visible, began to fill with new strength. His coat, once dull, now gleamed under the sunlight. The family made sure his bowl was never empty, but often. When food was offered, he would wait until the baby was fed, as though his hunger could wait but the child's could not. The baby, in turn, grew stronger too. He laughed more, crawling after the shepherd with clumsy determination. The dog was endlessly patient, lowering his massive head so tiny hands could tug at his ears, his tail thumping softly against the floor whenever the baby reached for him. Sometimes, in the quiet afternoons, the father would watch them through the cracked door, the baby babbling nonsense, the shepherd tilting his head as if listening intently, their conversation one of gestures and sounds that no one else could understand. "They talk?" the father whispered once, standing beside his wife. "They have their own language." The mother smiled through tears. "It's more than that." They breathed the same air now. But healing was not just physical, it was emotional. The shepherd, once haunted by abandonment, began to trust again. The nightmares that made him whine in his sleep grew fewer. Instead, he found solace in the baby's presence. If the child was near, the dog's body softened, his breathing slowed. The parents, too, found a kind of healing. The terror of nearly losing their child had changed them. The mother no longer rushed through her days distracted, and the father no longer brushed off danger with careless words. They held their son longer, studied his face more closely, listened for the subtleties in his breathing. And through it all, they recognized the dog's role, not just as guardian, but as teacher. He had shown them how to pay attention, how to see what was fragile and protect it fiercely. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, the family sat on the porch. The baby, now strong enough to pull himself upright, wobbled on unsteady legs, his tiny fists clutching the shepherd's fur for balance. The dog remained utterly still, a statue of patience, his eyes glinting with quiet pride. The baby laughed, a bubbling, pure sound that carried on the breeze. The shepherd's ears flicked, and then, as though to share in the moment, he released a soft, low howl, almost melodic. The sound startled the baby at first, but then the child laughed harder, reaching for the dog's face. The parents sat together, watching the tableau, their son standing, supported by the dog who had once been left starving against a fence, now the very pillar holding him steady. The father's hand closed over the mother's. His voice was hushed but resolute. He saved him once. He'll keep saving him, every day. The mother nodded, her gaze locked on the pair silhouetted against the falling sun. "They saved each other," she whispered. And in that moment, as shadows stretched long across the porch, it was clear healing was not an end. It was a beginning. And what had begun between a child and his dog was nothing short of extraordinary. The weeks of peace felt fragile, as if the family lived inside a bubble of light that could be pierced at any moment. The baby was growing stronger by the day. His giggles filled the house like music, his hands always reaching for his four-legged protector. The shepherd had transformed too, no longer gaunt but muscular, his fur sleek, his eyes bright. Yet even in this comfort, something in him remained restless. Like a soldier who has survived the battlefield but still sleeps with one ear open. It happened late one night, when the house lay in silence. The baby had been restless, crying in small bursts that the mother soothed with lullabies. Eventually, he drifted into a soft sleep. His hand curled around the shepherd's paw through the crib's wooden bars. The mother smiled at the sight before retreating to her room. But hours later, the shepherd awoke suddenly. His ears flicked. His head lifted sharply. There it was again, the sound of footsteps. Not inside but outside, crunching softly on gravel. His body stiffened, muscles tightening beneath his skin. He stood, moving to the window with silent precision. The night outside was ink black, the moon veiled by heavy clouds. But in the shifting shadows near the fence, he saw it, movement. A figure lingering, half hidden, watching. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. The baby stirred at the sound, letting out a small whimper. Immediately, the shepherd returned to the crib, pressing his nose through the bars, nudging the baby with reassurance. Then, his gaze swung back toward the window, his hackles raised. Down the hallway, the parents stirred. The father woke first, catching the sound of the growl echoing through the house. He nudged his wife, whispering, "Do you hear that?" She nodded, fear tightening her face. The father grabbed the flashlight and crept to the baby's room. The shepherd was already standing guard, body tense, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. The father's heart sank when he followed the dog's gaze. There, just beyond the yard, a man stood motionless, watching. For a moment terror froze him, then instinct took over. He pulled out his phone, snapping a photo through the glass as his wife dialed the police with trembling hands. The shepherd barked suddenly, a sharp, furious sound that split the night. The man startled, then retreated into the shadows, disappearing like smoke. The baby woke with a startled cry, his small body trembling from the noise. The shepherd immediately softened, turning back to the crib, whining softly, licking the child's hand to calm him. The shift in his behavior was almost startling. One moment a beast ready for war, the next a gentle guardian soothing a frightened soul. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was gone. They walked the property, shining their flashlights into the dark corners of the yard, but found nothing. Probably just a trespasser. One of them said dismissively, but the father knew better. This was no accident. The memory of the attempted break, in weeks before, resurfaced like a wound torn open. The mother clutched the baby tighter that night, refusing to let him sleep in his crib. She sat with him in the rocking chair, her body curled protectively around him. And all the while, the shepherd stayed by the door, unmoving, his ears perked, his eyes locked on the darkness outside as though daring it to try again. The days after the incident carried a tension that pressed on the family's chest. The baby seemed to sense it too. He clung to the shepherd more than usual, crying whenever the dog left the room. The shepherd indulged him, lying close, letting small hands tug at his ears, his fur, anything to keep him near. The father reinforced the locks, adding new cameras around the property. But even with all his efforts, he knew the greatest security they had wasn't made of bolts or steel. It was fur and flesh, teeth and loyalty. Still, fear had a way of echoing through the walls. Every creak of the floorboards at night made the mother tense. Every passing shadow through the window made the father grip the edge of his seat. They were grateful, yes, but they were also haunted by the truth that someone had been watching, waiting. And at the center of it all, the shepherd never faltered. He patrolled the house at night, his paws clicking softly on the hardwood. He pressed his nose against the baby's chest often, listening for that steady rhythm of breath. His body was lean muscle now, ready to defend at any cost. But behind his vigilance, there was something else too, a weight he carried, a burden, as though he knew the past had not yet let go. One evening, the father found himself sitting on the porch steps, watching the shepherd as he stood at the edge of the yard, eyes locked on the tree line. The dog was still as stone, his tail low, ears pricked. The father sighed, running a hand over his face. "You're not wrong to worry," he whispered. "Neither of us is." The shepherd flicked an ear but did not look back. He remained locked on the distance, his stance a mixture of defiance and warning. The baby's laughter broke the tension a moment later, as he toddled across the porch with the mother's support. The shepherd finally turned, his expression softening the instant he saw the child. He patted back quickly, lowering his head so the baby could press his face into his fur. The father watched this exchange with something like awe. He realized then that the shepherd wasn't just a dog waiting for danger. He was a creature who carried both fear and love in equal measure. He was haunted, yes, but he was also whole, because of the bond he shared with the baby. That night, as the house quieted, the baby slept peacefully in his crib. The shepherd lay stretched out beside it, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the child's. His ears twitched at every noise, his nose catching every scent. But when the baby stirred in his sleep, mumbling softly, the dog let out a quiet whine and pressed his muzzle through the bars. The baby reached blindly, found him, and calmed instantly. The echoes of fear still lingered in the walls of the house, in the hearts of the parents. But for the baby, there was no fear, not while his shepherd was near. And maybe that was enough. For even in the face of shadows, there is strength in knowing you are not alone. And this child, fragile as he was, had a protector who would never yield. And though fear might echo through the night, love always answered louder. The house stood quiet under the weight of midnight. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, whispering against the glass. The cameras mounted on the property blinked with their tiny red lights, casting faint glows into the yard. For the parents, these measures were enough to create an illusion of safety. But the shepherd knew better. He was awake long before the danger revealed itself. His ears flicked at the faint crunch of grass, his nostrils flaring at the scent drifting on the breeze. Sharp, foreign, familiar in the worst way. His body tensed. This was not a passing fox or a neighbor's cat. This was human. The dog rose silently, moving to the baby's crib. He pressed his nose against the child's hair, inhaling the soft, milky scent that grounded him. The baby stirred but did not wake. Satisfied, the shepherd padded to the window. His eyes narrowed. There he was again. The man. A dark silhouette clung to the edges of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. He stood unnervingly still, his face hidden in shadow. The shepherd's throat vibrated with a growl that built low, like thunder gathering in the distance. The mother woke first, the sound prickling the edges of her dream. She sat up, listening, heart pounding. The growl wasn't the restless kind she'd come to know. This was different, lower, sharper. Warning. She shook her husband awake, whispering urgently. The father grabbed the baseball bat from beside the bed. Stay here, he murmured, though his own voice trembled. But the shepherd's growls grew louder, sharper, drawing both parents into the baby's room. The sight stopped them cold. The shepherd stood rigid, body between the crib and the window, teeth bared, every hair along his spine raised. The baby slept on undisturbed, but the dog's intensity was unmistakable. The father followed his gaze to the yard, and froze. A figure lingered at the fence, watching. Unmoving. The father's stomach turned to ice. He snapped on the flashlight and shone it through the glass. The beam caught the man's shape, clearly now tall, hooded, hands resting on the fence as though testing it. The shepherd barked with a violence that rattled the window, his teeth snapping, saliva flying as he lunged at the glass. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he lifted a hand slowly and pressed a finger to his lips. A sick, taunting gesture. Then he vanished into the shadows. The mother gasped, clutching the baby from the crib, holding him against her chest as if she could fuse his body with hers. The father raced outside, flashlight and bat in hand, but the yard was empty. The cameras blinked overhead, recording nothing but still frames of darkness. When he returned, the mother sat rocking in the chair, whispering prayers into the baby's hair. The shepherd paced the room, restless, growling at every corner as though the shadows themselves carried threats. He's watching us? The mother whispered. Has not done. The father wanted to deny it, to offer comfort, but the truth was carved into his bones. Whoever that man was, he had no intention of leaving them alone. The following days blurred with exhaustion. The parents doubled down on security. Floodlights, reinforced locks, constant checks on the cameras. But safety was more fragile than ever. Every time the wind rustled the trees, the mother jumped. Every time the baby cried out at night, the father bolted upright in fear. The shepherd, too, had changed. His restlessness deepened into obsession. He rarely left the baby's side, even for meals. He slept pressed against the crib, his ears twitching, his nose twitching at the slightest change in air. When the baby laughed, he softened, but the moment passed, and the edge returned. One evening, as the family tried to relax in the living room, the baby sat on the rug, slapping his hands against a toy drum. The shepherd lay nearby, his eyes soft as he watched. The child babbled happily, leaning into the dog's fur. For a fleeting moment, everything felt normal. But then the power cut out. The house plunged into darkness. The baby stilled. The mother gasped. The father cursed, fumbling for his phone. And the shepherd? He was already on his feet, ears pinned back, growl rising like a storm. The silence was suffocating. Outside, the faint creak of the gate echoed, slow, deliberate. The father's phone light cut a weak beam through the dark, but it was the shepherd who moved first. He lunged to the door, barking with explosive force, his body slamming against the wood as though daring the intruder to enter. The baby began to cry, his tiny wails piercing the suffocating dark. The mother held him close, rocking him desperately, her eyes darting to her husband. "What do we do?" The father's hands shook as he dialed emergency services, whispering into the phone, "Hayes here." He cut the power. "Please, send someone now?" But every second stretched into eternity. The gate creaked again. The sound of footsteps on the porch followed. The shepherd went wild. His barks turned to snarls, his teeth flashing in the faint light as he clawed at the door. The man outside jiggled the handle once, twice, then stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the footsteps retreated. The gate squealed shut. Moments later, the lights flickered back on. The police arrived long after the man had gone, once again finding nothing but empty yards and shaken parents. The baby had finally quieted, nestled against the shepherd's chest, clutching fistfuls of fur in his sleep. The officer shook his head. "We'll increase patrols," he promised, but his eyes betrayed doubt. He didn't believe they'd catch him. The father closed the door behind them, his heart sinking into his stomach. He looked at his wife, pale and trembling, the baby asleep in her arms. Then his eyes found the shepherd. The dog's chest rose and fell with steady determination, his gaze sharp, unyielding. He had not wavered once, not when the shadows pressed against the glass, not when the door rattled under the intruder's hand. He had stood his ground. The father knelt, pressing his forehead to the shepherd's. "It's you?" he whispered. "You're the line between us and him. You're the only thing he's afraid of." The shepherd's ears twitched. He exhaled through his nose, leaning into the man's touch, but his eyes never softened. They stayed locked on the window, on the dark outside. For though the man had retreated, the shadows had not. And the shepherd knew this was only the beginning. The house no longer slept the way it once did. Nights had become long stretches of silence, broken only by the faint hum of the baby's breath, the creak of the floorboards, or the restless pacing of the shepherd. Fear had changed the air inside those walls. It lingered like a draft, invisible but always felt. And yet, amid that unease, something else had grown too. A bond, raw and unshakable. The shepherd had claimed his role fully now, a sentinel in fur and bone. He was not merely the family's pet, he was the shield, the line between innocence and danger. His instincts sharpened. His awareness stretched thin across every corner of the home. When the baby whimpered in his sleep, the dog was there in an instant, pressing close, nudging the child until the cries softened. When the mother bent to lift her son, the shepherd's eyes tracked every movement, his tail low but wagging softly, reassurance blending with vigilance. He had become a shadow, never more than a few feet away. The parents, exhausted by fear, found comfort in him too. It wasn't just his presence, but his consistency. The father would often wake at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat from restless dreams, only to find the shepherd sitting by the crib, his chest rising and falling with calm certainty, his amber eyes glinting faintly in the nightlight glow. One night, the mother broke into tears at the sight of it. She had been holding her baby after a restless feeding, and when she looked up, there was the shepherd, stretched out beside the rocker, his gaze locked on her, as if to say, "You are not alone. I will not let anything touch him." She whispered, through sobs, "You're the guardian angel I never asked for." The dog shifted, resting his chin on her foot. He didn't move again until both mother and baby drifted to sleep. But vigilance came with a price. The shepherd no longer rested deeply. His sleep was fractured, shallow, his ears flicking at every noise. His body carried tension, his muscles taut even when lying still. The family noticed his ribs showing again, not from neglect but from ceaseless energy burned in his watch. The father began cooking extra meat, setting aside portions for him, coaxing him to eat, to keep his strength. "You can't protect us if you waste away," the father murmured one evening, placing a bowl of chicken at the shepherd's feet. The dog obeyed, reluctantly, though his gaze kept darting to the window, as though the man in the shadows might return at any second. It was as if he knew. Danger was not gone. It only waited. One evening, a storm rolled in. Heavy rain lashed against the glass, drowning the yard in sheets of silver. Thunder shook the walls. Lightning cut the sky into jagged fragments. The baby startled at the first crash, crying in sharp bursts. The mother tried soothing him, rocking and humming, but her own nerves were frayed. The shepherd climbed onto the rug beside them, pressing close, his body a barrier of warmth. The baby, sensing him, reached a tiny hand into his fur, gripping it as if anchoring himself. The dog lowered his head, nuzzling the child gently, and the cries slowed. The mother watched, her heart aching with gratitude. When another thunderclap rattled the room, she flinched. But the baby did not. His little chest rose steady now, calmed by the shepherd's presence. The storm might have shaken the house, but inside, a different kind of calm had been restored. The father, watching from the doorway, realized then that the shepherd was not just protecting them from the man outside. He was shielding them from their own fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of shadows, storms, the fragility of safety. The dog carried that weight for them, absorbing it into his growls, his restless pacing, his sharp-eyed stares through glass. And though they worried for him, though they knew his burden was heavy, they also knew they could not survive without it. The days that followed grew stranger still. The man had not returned, not visibly. But signs emerged, subtle, chilling. A cigarette butt by the back gate. Footprints pressed into the mud near the fence. A scrap of cloth snagged on the wire. The police came again, jotting down notes, offering empty reassurances. But the shepherd didn't need proof. He knew. His growls at night came without sight of the intruder, his hackles raised when the yard looked empty. The baby, too, seemed to sense it, clinging tighter to the shepherd's fur whenever the air grew too still, or his cries peaking only to quiet the moment the dog pressed close. They were a pair now, bound by something wordless. The baby trusted him absolutely. The shepherd, in turn, lived only for the child's safety. One evening, after a rare moment of laughter during dinner, the father leaned back and sighed. You know, he was tied to a fence when we found him. Starving, hopeless. And now, he trailed off, shaking his head. Now he's saving us. The mother finished softly, her eyes on the shepherd curled by the crib. Maybe he was meant to be here. Meant for him. She nodded toward the baby, who lay nestled against the dog, tiny fingers still woven in his fur. A silence followed, heavy but tender. Fate had a strange way of weaving lives together, sometimes through suffering, sometimes through terror. But here, in this fragile haven, love had been born of both. That night, as the rain eased and the world outside quieted, the shepherd remained at his post. His head lifted every so often, ears twitching, nose tasting the air. But his body stayed pressed close to the crib, the baby's fingers tangled in his coat. The darkness still lurked beyond the fence. The threat had not faded. But inside these walls, under the watchful gaze of the guardian, peace held for another night. For now that was enough. The nights had grown quieter, but inside the father, a storm was brewing. On the surface, life went on. He woke early, went to work, came home with groceries, helped bathe the baby. But beneath all of it lay a gnawing dread, a restless tension that no amount of routine could smother. The man who had once prowled their fence line had not returned outright, yet the signs lingered like whispers. The footprints, the cigarette butts, the uneasy silence at odd hours of night. The father found himself scanning the yard every morning, his eyes darting to corners, to shadows. He checked locks twice, 3 times, ran his hands over the fence posts like a soldier inspecting defenses. He tried to hide his worry from his wife, from the baby, but he couldn't hide it from the dog. The shepherd knew. Every time the father's shoulders tensed, the shepherd was there, pacing at his side, amber eyes searching the same darkness. When the father sat at the table long after everyone else had gone to bed, the shepherd lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, silent and unblinking. The bond between them had deepened not in words, but in a shared weight they both carried, the duty of protection. One evening, the father lost his calm. The baby had cried for hours, teething, restless. His wife looked exhausted, her face pale with lack of sleep. and outside, the wind rattled the loose shutters, mimicking the sound of hands at the window. The father jolted upright, grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the door, and stormed into the yard barefoot, shirtless, his breath sharp in the cold air. He shouted into the night, his voice cracking with fury and fear. "Come on then! You think you can scare my family? Show yourself!" The shepherd followed, barking, low and guttural, his body rigid and ready. His growl filled the empty yard, but no intruder answered. Only the echo of the father's voice, bouncing back from the neighboring houses, returned to them. The father stood there in the wet grass, chest heaving, bat clenched in his hand, and for the first time, he looked less like a man and more like a creature cornered. The storm within him had spilled out, and it terrified him more than anything lurking outside. The shepherd pressed against his leg, a grounding weight. The man looked down at the dog, his hand trembling as it brushed through the thick fur. "I'm losing it, aren't I?" he whispered. The shepherd blinked up at him, steady, unwavering. In that gaze, the father felt something he hadn't in weeks. Anchored, he dropped the bat, his knees buckling into the grass, his head bowed. The shepherd leaned against him fully, the way one soldier might steady another in the battlefield. Inside, the mother had been watching from the window. Her hand pressed to the glass, heart in her throat. She whispered to herself, "We're all unraveling." But then she saw it, the shepherd, shoulder against her husband, refusing to let him collapse completely. She saw her baby sleeping peacefully upstairs, hand still curled in a tiny fist. And for a brief, fragile moment, she realized the truth. Without the dog, the cracks in their lives might already have broken them apart. The storm was not only outside. It lived inside them, in their fear, their sleeplessness, their helplessness. But the shepherd bore it too. He absorbed it, steadied it, shouldered it. That night, when the father finally came inside, he sank onto the couch, his face pale and tired. His wife sat beside him, the baby cradled against her chest. She reached out, lacing her fingers through his. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said softly. His jaw trembled, and for once, he didn't argue. He glanced at the shepherd curled at their feet, eyes half shut, but ears still pricked, always listening. "He doesn't let me," the father whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. Not even for a second. The mother leaned her head on his shoulder. The baby stirred in her arms, a small sigh escaping his lips, and the shepherd exhaled too, a deep, weary sound, before settling closer, as if pulling them all into a single circle of protection. The days that followed were quieter, but not calmer. The father avoided looking in mirrors because when he did, he saw the strain in his own eyes, the red veins spidering through the whites. He kept his voice steady for his wife, but inside he was cracking. And yet, every time he felt the spiral pull at him, the shepherd was there, resting his head on the man's knee, pressing against his hand, following him into the yard as if to share in his nightly inspections. The father began talking to the shepherd in those late hours, words he couldn't tell anyone else. "I'm scared," he confessed one night, staring into the blackness of the yard. "I don't want to fail them. I don't want to freeze if it ever comes to it." The shepherd leaned against his leg, unyielding. No answers came, but the silence was stronger than words. It was as if the dog said, "Then we will not fail them, not together." But storms, even those within, cannot be ignored forever. One afternoon, as rain streaked the windows, the father held his baby close and felt the fragile weight of him. Soft skin, tiny breaths, complete trust. And a thought pierced him so sharp it nearly buckled his knees. What if I can't protect him? What if all I can do is watch? His chest clenched. Panic rose, wild and suffocating. But before the spiral could consume him, the shepherd padded over, pressing his nose against the baby's foot, tail swishing softly. The baby giggled at the touch, the sound bright and unburdened. The father's breath hitched, and for the first time in weeks, laughter escaped him too. Raw, shaky, but real. The storm within him cracked open, not with thunder, but with release. He realized then that the shepherd wasn't just a guardian for his child. He was a guardian for him too, dragging him back from the edge of despair, reminding him of the love still alive in their house. That night, as he tucked the baby into bed, the father whispered, "You've got two guardians, little one? Me and him. And we'll fight every storm. outside and in, until it's calm again. The shepherd curled at the crib's base, eyes heavy but still alert, as though he'd heard every word. And perhaps in some deep, unspoken way, he had. For the first time in weeks, the father slept without waking. And outside, the wind shifted. The storm within had eased, even if the one beyond their fence still lingered. It happened on a night that should have been ordinary. The baby had just drifted to sleep, his tiny breaths even and steady in the soft glow of the nightlight. The mother sat in the rocking chair, humming faintly, her eyes half closed. The father was in the kitchen rinsing dishes, listening to the low trickle of water over porcelain. Outside, the air was still, eerily still, as if the world were holding its breath. The shepherd, however, was restless. He paced near the window, ears flicking, tail stiff. Every so often he gave a low whine, pausing to press his nose against the crack of the door. His body spoke louder than words could. Something was wrong. The father dried his hands and frowned. "What is it, boy?" The shepherd barked once, sharp, insistent. His hackles lifted as he stared into the yard. The father peered out into the darkness, his pulse quickening. At first, he saw nothing. But then, a flicker, movement near the fence. A figure, crouched low, the same shadow that had haunted them for weeks. The father's heart slammed in his chest. He lunged for the baseball bat by the door, motioning for his wife to stay quiet. The shepherd was already growling, his body vibrating with tension. The father cracked the door open, bat in hand, but before he could step outside, the figure moved fast. Climbing the fence, slipping into the yard with terrifying ease. "Stay inside!" The father hissed at his wife, his voice trembling. The intruder landed with a thud on the wet grass. He wore a hood, his face shadowed, and in his hand gleamed something metallic. Too long, too sharp to be anything but a knife. The shepherd erupted. His bark tore through the night like thunder, his body a streak of fur and muscle charging across the yard. The man staggered back, startled by the sudden ferocity, but didn't retreat. He slashed the air with the blade, a hiss of steel under the porch light. The father's chest seized with terror. "No," he shouted, rushing forward, but the shepherd was faster. He lunged, teeth bared, his jaws clamping down on the intruder's wrist with a sound like bone snapping. The man cursed, the knife clattering into the mud. The struggle was chaos. Shouts, growls, the sound of bodies hitting the ground. The shepherd fought with a primal rage. Each bark a warning, each bite a promise: "You will not touch this family." The father swung the bat, striking the intruder's shoulder, then again across his back. The man cried out, wrenching free and stumbling toward the fence. The shepherd lunged again, catching his pant leg, ripping fabric as the man scrambled desperately up the boards. With one final heave, the intruder vaulted over, disappearing into the darkness. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of rain dripping from the gutters and the shepherd's heavy panting. The father stood frozen, chest heaving, bat still clenched in his hand. His eyes darted to the shepherd. Mud streaked across his fur, his jaw flecked with blood that wasn't his own. The dog's sides heaved, but his gaze remained fixed on the fence, ears high, body taut, as if daring the man to return. "Dear God," the father whispered. His wife appeared in the doorway, the baby in her arms, her face pale with horror. The shepherd turned to them then, his eyes softening. He padded back to the porch, tail low but wagging faintly, as though to reassure them. "I did it. You're safe." The mother dropped to her knees, clutching the dog's face in her hands. "You saved us," she sobbed, tears streaking her cheeks. The baby reached out, fingers brushing the shepherd's ear. The dog nuzzled closer, pressing his weight against them as if anchoring the family back to earth. The police came again, their lights flashing red and blue against the wet pavement. They took statements, collected the knife, inspected the torn fabric from the fence. Their voices were firm but uncertain. "We'll increase patrols. Keep your doors locked. He won't try again." But the father knew better. He had seen the man's eyes in that split second of light. Cold, determined. This wasn't over. Still, something had shifted. The family was shaken, but not broken, and they had seen, with their own eyes, the lengths their shepherd would go. Later, when the house was finally quiet again, the father sat on the floor by the crib. The baby slept peacefully, one hand still curled into a fist. The shepherd lay at his feet, chest rising and falling, eyes half closed but still alert. The father whispered into the dim room, his voice cracking with both gratitude and fear. You saved us tonight. If I hadn't found you, if you hadn't been here. He couldn't finish the thought. He reached down, burying his face into the shepherd's neck, inhaling the earthy scent of mud and fur. You're more than a dog. You're family. You're his lifeline. The shepherd licked his cheek once, slow and deliberate, before lowering his head onto his paws. And for the first time in weeks, the storm outside no longer mattered. Inside this small house, love had proven stronger than fear. But deep down, they all knew the real trial still lay ahead. The attack left an echo in the house. Even after the yard was empty, even after the police lights faded down the street, the silence was charged, every creak of the floorboards like a warning. The parents checked the locks twice, 3 times. The baby stirred in his crib, unaware of the storm that had passed, his tiny chest rising and falling with an innocence that both comforted and terrified them. The shepherd, however, knew better. He lay stretched across the nursery doorway, eyes wide open, muscles tense beneath his fur. Every sound, wind against the shutters, the drip of water in the sink, sent a shiver through his frame. He was not resting. He was waiting. The next day, sunlight streamed through the curtains, fragile and soft. To the mother, it felt false, as though daylight itself had betrayed them by pretending the night hadn't happened. She cradled the baby at the kitchen table, humming softly while the shepherd stood guard at her side. But then it happened. The thing every parent fears. The moment where safety crumbles in an instant. The father had gone outside to gather the morning paper. The shepherd followed him, nose twitching in the damp grass. And in that span of absence, the house became vulnerable. The back door clicked open, silently, deliberately. The mother's head jerked up, confusion flashing across her face. Mark, she called, thinking it was her husband. But the air shifted. A shadow fell across the floor. Was him, the intruder. He had returned. The shepherd's growl reverberated through the walls before the man even stepped fully inside. He bolted back in through the kitchen door, barking with a violence that seemed to shake the floorboards. The mother screamed, clutching the baby to her chest. The man lunged forward, desperate, his hand outstretched toward the child. Perhaps it was madness, perhaps revenge. But the shepherd intercepted, his body a wall of fur and muscle. His teeth snapped so close the man yelped, jerking his arm back before it could reach its target. The baby cried out, a piercing wail that filled the room with panic. The mother staggered backward, pressing against the wall, shielding the child with her own body. She felt her breath catch, her knees weaken, but she refused to collapse. Every fiber of her being screamed, protect him. The intruder snarled, swinging wildly, shoving at the shepherd with brute force. But the dog refused to give ground. He lunged again, jaws closing on the man's sleeve, dragging him sideways. The two crashed into the kitchen table, sending dishes flying, shattering against the floor. The shepherd was strong, but the man was desperate. He kicked hard, and knocking the dog back just enough to stagger toward the mother again. That was the moment the baby slipped. In the chaos, his tiny body slipped from her trembling grip, landing onto the rug with a cry. The world froze. The mother screamed. The intruder lunged. The baby wailed, and the shepherd moved like lightning. He darted between them, his body covering the child, his jaws snapping with lethal intent. His growl was primal, unearthly, no longer just a dog's warning, but a living wall of fury and devotion. The intruder hesitated, knife flashing in his hand. He raised it high, aiming for the shepherd's back. Oh no, the mother shrieked. The knife came down, but met the shepherd's teeth. In a split second of impossible reflex, the dog twisted his head upward, jaws closing around the intruder's wrist mid-strike. The blade clattered to the floor, skidding across the tile. Blood sprayed. The man howled, stumbling backward. The shepherd didn't let go. He drove forward, pushing the man toward the doorway, snarling, biting, forcing him step by step out of the house. The father burst in through the front door just then, horror exploding across his face. He saw his wife trembling against the wall, the baby on the floor wailing, and the shepherd locked in a deadly struggle at the back door. Get out of my house! The father roared, charging forward. He grabbed the fallen knife, pressing it to the man's throat in a single, desperate motion. The intruder froze. His body shook, his breath came ragged. The shepherd finally released his grip, though his growl still rumbled like thunder. "Get out," the father hissed, "or you won't walk out at all." The man staggered backward, clutching his bleeding wrist. His eyes burned with rage, but fear finally broke through. He stumbled into the yard and fled. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the baby's cry, raw and heart-wrenching. The mother dropped to her knees, scooping him up, pressing frantic kisses to his head. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered over and over, "You're safe? You're safe?" The shepherd limped toward them, one paw slightly cut from glass, blood staining his muzzle. He lowered his head onto the baby's blanket, whining softly, as though asking if the little one was truly all right. The baby's cries softened. His tiny hand reached out, brushing the dog's ear. The shepherd licked his fingers once, then pressed his nose into the child's chest, listening to the rhythm of his breath. Between breath and hope, the bond was sealed again. Stronger, deeper. That night, after police sirens and paramedics had gone, the family gathered in the living room. The baby slept soundly on his mother's chest, the father's arm around them both. And the shepherd lay at their feet, battered but unbroken. The father whispered into the quiet, voice rough with gratitude, "You're not just his guardian. You're his lifeline." The shepherd lifted his head at the words, his eyes meeting the father's. For a moment, it felt as though the dog understood. And maybe, just maybe, he did. The house never felt the same after that second attack. Locks were changed, alarms installed. Motion lights strung around the perimeter, but the sense of violation lingered in the walls. The parents barely slept, rising at the faintest sound. And through it all, the shepherd carried himself like a sentinel who could never rest. Every night he patrolled the hall, nose pressed against the floorboards, ears twitching to every vibration. Sometimes he would stop at the crib, resting his muzzle on the railing as the baby slept, sighing heavily before returning to his post at the door. His body grew leaner, his fur coarser, but his eyes never dulled. He lived in a state of constant readiness. But deep inside, the family knew the danger wasn't over. Men like that intruder didn't vanish into shadows. They bided their time. They watched. The storm came 3 nights later. Rain lashed against the windows, rattling the panes like fists. The wind howled, carrying the scent of wet earth and ozone. The parents huddled in the living room, the baby cradled against his mother's chest. The shepherd paced the doorway, restless, unsettled, every nerve alive with anticipation. It was then the power went out. The house sank into darkness. The baby whimpered, sensing the tension in the air. The mother kissed his forehead, whispering, "Shah, it's okay. We're okay," but her voice trembled, betraying the fear gnawing at her heart. The father lit a candle, the flame flickering weakly against the storm outside. He checked the locks again, though he knew it was useless. Locks were for honest men. The shepherd stopped suddenly, his nose lifting toward the back door. His ears pricked, his body stiffened. Then he growled, a low, rolling thunder that seemed to vibrate through the floor. The father followed his gaze. Through the window, lightning split the sky, and for an instant, a shadow moved across the yard. "They're here?" he whispered. The assault came fast. The back door shattered inward, wood splintering under the force of a boot. 3 men rushed in, faces masked, weapons glinting in the candlelight. The father lunged forward, grabbing the closest intruder, grappling desperately. The mother screamed, clutching the baby to her chest, backing into the corner. And the shepherd launched himself into the fray. He hit the first man like a battering ram, teeth sinking into his arm, dragging him to the ground. The intruder howled, swinging wildly, but the dog refused to release. His growl filled the room like a war drum. The second man swung a pipe, striking the shepherd across the ribs. The crack was sickening, and for a moment his body faltered. But when the baby cried out, a small, terrified sound, the shepherd surged up again, rage igniting in his veins. He lunged, jaws clamping down on the man's shoulder, dragging him backward with inhuman strength. Blood smeared across the floor. The candle toppled, plunging the room into near darkness. Save for the flashes of lightning that revealed the chaos in stuttering frames. The father fighting with bare hands, the mother shielding the baby, The shepherd locked in combat against impossible odds. Then the third man appeared, the one who had come before. The intruder. The face that haunted the mother's nightmares. His eyes gleamed with fury as he strode toward the corner, knife in hand, reaching for the baby. The shepherd saw him, and something primal broke loose inside him. Despite the pain in his ribs, despite the blood dripping from his muzzle, he tore himself free of the fight and hurled his body across the room. The knife slashed downward, but met fur and flesh instead of the baby. The shepherd had thrown himself between them. The blade sank deep into his side. He didn't cry out. He didn't falter. Instead, he locked his jaws onto the intruder's throat, driving him backward with every ounce of strength left in his battered frame. The two crashed through the doorway, tumbling into the storm-soaked yard. The family screamed, "Mother, father," even the baby's wail carrying into the night, as they watched the dog and the man roll in the mud, locked in a life and death struggle. Lightning illuminated the scene. The shepherd, blood staining his fur, teeth tearing, refusing to let go. The intruder clawed, stabbed, kicked, but the dog's will was unbreakable. For the baby. For his family. The police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. But the shepherd couldn't wait for help. He drove the man into the fence. The same kind of fence he himself had once been tied to, starving, abandoned. Now it was the intruder's turn to feel trapped. The shepherd pinned him there, growling through clenched jaws, blood running down his side. The man's knife slipped from his hand, clattering into the mud. His eyes widened with terror as he realized the truth he had lost. The shepherd held him there, chest heaving, eyes blazing. He didn't kill him. He didn't need to. He simply held him, forcing him to face the strength of a creature he had underestimated. When the police stormed the yard, guns raised, they found the man pinned beneath the shepherd, trembling in the mud, unable to move. The dog staggered back then, his strength finally giving out. He collapsed onto the wet grass, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The mother screamed his name, rushing into the storm with the baby in her arms. She knelt beside him, tears mixing with the rain. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, stay with me." The baby reached out, his tiny hand brushing the shepherd's ear. His soft touch seemed to anchor the dog to the world, pulling him back from the edge of darkness. The father dropped beside them, clutching the shepherd's head, whispering words he'd never spoken aloud. "You saved us. Your family. Don't leave us now." The shepherd's eyes flickered open, weak, tired, but alive. He pressed his nose against the baby's chest, listening once more to the rhythm of his heartbeat. And in that fragile moment, between life and death, between sacrifice and survival, the lifeline held. The shepherd survived the night, but barely. By the time the ambulance lights painted the soaked yard red and blue, the family had wrapped him in blankets, pressing trembling hands against the wound in his side. His breath was shallow, raspy, flecked with blood. The baby's cries had softened into hiccups. His small face pressed against the shepherd's neck, as though his warmth alone could anchor the dog to life. The medics rushed the intruders away in handcuffs, but the family cared little for them. Their eyes never left the shepherd. They begged the officers for help, for transport, for anything that could save him. The police cruiser doors opened, and within minutes the dog lay stretched across the back seat, the father holding his head steady as they raced to the nearest emergency vet. The ride blurred in a haze of rain and flashing sirens. The mother rocked the baby against her chest, whispering prayers that rose above the storm. The father stroked the shepherd's ear, murmuring, "Hold on, boy. You've come too far to leave us now." The dog's eyelids fluttered, his body limp, but when the baby gave a tiny whimper, his tail thumped once against the seat. The clinic doors burst open. White light flooded their eyes. The smell of disinfectant clung to the air. Hands in gloves pulled him from the car, rushing him onto a gurney. Knife wound. Severe blood loss. Possible internal injury. A voice announced as the family stumbled behind, desperate, helpless. Then the doors slammed shut. The family was left in the waiting room, drenched, shaking, hearts hammering with the silence that followed. Hours stretched. The storm outside subsided into a damp, suffocating quiet. The baby slept in his mother's arms, his tiny fist curled tightly into her shirt. The father paced the length of the room, shoes leaving wet prints on the linoleum. Every so often, he stopped to press his palms together, whispering words to a god he had not prayed to in years. Finally, the door creaked open. The vet stepped out, mask pulled down, face etched with exhaustion. The family froze, searching his eyes. "He's alive," the vet said, voice steady but grave. "But the surgery was long. He lost a lot of blood. The next 24 hours will decide everything." The mother wept into the baby's hair. The father let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. The baby stirred, eyes blinking open. And for the first time in hours, he gurgled softly, as though he too understood the weight of those words. The shepherd remained in the clinic for days. Tubes and bandages covered his body, his breath shallow but steady. The family visited every hour, sitting by his side, whispering encouragement. The baby would reach for him, and though the shepherd could not lift his head, his eyes would follow, tracking every sound, every small movement. On the third night, the vet allowed the family to stay longer. The father sat in the corner, head bowed. The mother hummed softly, rocking the baby to sleep. And when the baby's tiny hand brushed against the shepherd's paw, something shifted. His tail moved, slowly, weakly, but enough to send a ripple through the room. The mother gasped. The father looked up, eyes shining. And the baby giggled, a sound of pure joy that filled the sterile space with something sacred. The shepherd had chosen to fight. Recovery was long, grueling. Weeks of careful feeding. Gentle walks, painkillers hidden in food. The father carried him up and down the porch steps. The mother laid blankets on the floor so he could rest near the crib. The baby grew stronger during those weeks too, learning to crawl, to reach, to pull himself up against the furniture. Every new milestone he reached, the shepherd watched, his eyes reflecting a quiet pride. Their bond grew deeper than words could capture. The baby would crawl to the shepherd's side, pressing his face into his fur, babbling nonsense as though confiding secrets only the dog could understand. The shepherd, though weak, would nuzzle back, closing his eyes as though promising, "I'm still here. I'll always be here." But scars remained, not just on the dog's body but in the air around them. Nights were restless. Every creak in the house sent the father to check doors. Every gust of wind made the mother clutch the baby closer. Trauma lingered, clinging like smoke long after the fire had passed. Then came the fire. It started weeks later, in the dead of night, when the family had just begun to breathe again. Faulty wiring in the kitchen sparked, flames catching on old wood. By the time smoke alarms shrieked, the fire had spread fast, ravenous. The father leapt from bed, dragging his wife up, scooping the baby into his arms. But when they reached the hall, smoke billowed, thick and choking. Flames licked at the walls, the exit blocked. Panic clawed at their throats. And then, through the haze, the shepherd appeared, weakened, scarred, still limping, but his eyes burned with determination. He barked once, sharp, commanding, and darted into the smoke. He found a path, a small opening through the back porch. He returned, nudging, growling, guiding them toward it. The family followed, coughing, eyes stinging, clutching the baby tight. The fire roared, beams cracking, the house collapsing around them. But the shepherd pressed forward, leading them through the inferno, his body shielding them from falling debris, his bark cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. They stumbled into the night air just as the roof gave way behind them, the house collapsing into flames. The father fell to his knees, clutching his wife and baby, gasping for air. The shepherd staggered beside them, suit clinging to his fur, chest heaving. The baby reached out from his mother's arms, touching the shepherd's snout. His small, soot-smudged face broke into a smile. The shepherd lowered himself to the ground, curling his body protectively around the family, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and triumph. Through the storm, through the knife, through the fire, he had never once let go of them. The fire stripped the family of nearly everything. Their home was reduced to charred beams and ash, the air around it heavy with the smell of smoke for days after. What they carried out of that night was fragile, but unbroken's a baby, a bond, and a shepherd who had once again placed his body between them and death. They were moved temporarily into a small rented cottage on the edge of town. It wasn't much: peeling paint, a leaky faucet, floors that creaked with every step. But to them, it was sanctuary. Every corner of that little house was filled with gratitude. They breathed differently within its walls. Every morning they woke to the sound of the baby's laughter and the shepherd's soft tail thumps. And that was enough. But the shepherd was not the same. His wounds had healed into thick scars, but inside, his body carried the weight of all he had endured. He moved slower, his gait uneven, and when storms gathered, he trembled, memories flickering behind his eyes. The parents worried. They whispered at night about whether he would survive the years to come, whether his strength was finally running out. But then they would hear the baby stir, and the shepherd would lift his head, rising stiffly to press his nose to the crib. He never faltered when it came to the child. His duty was etched into his very bones. Winter came early that year. Bitter winds howled across the fields, and snow piled high against the cottage door. The baby had learned to walk, wobbling on unsteady legs, arms outstretched as the shepherd shadowed him step for step. Sometimes he would stumble, and before his tiny body hit the ground, the dog would nudge his shoulder, steadying him. They were inseparable now. Two lives braided together so tightly that one seemed incomplete without the other. Then came the trial no one could have prepared for. It was dusk when the father ventured into town for supplies, leaving the mother in the cottage with the baby. The shepherd lay near the fire, his eyes half closed, enjoying the warmth against his stiff joints. The mother hummed softly as she fed the baby mashed vegetables, his giggles filling the room. But outside, the storm thickened. Snow fell faster, heavier, until the world beyond the windows blurred into white. The father's return was delayed. Hours passed. And then, just as the mother began to pace the room with worry, there came a sound that made the shepherd's head snap up. A howl, not his. Not a domestic cry. It was the wild sound of wolves, carried on the wind. The mother froze, clutching the baby close. The shepherd rose to his feet, every muscle taut, ears pricked. Another howl followed, closer this time. Then the scrape of claws against the back door. The cottage was remote, far from neighbors. The storm had driven the wolves down from the hills in search of food. And now, drawn by the scent of warmth, of life, they had come to the door. The first wolf struck hard, its weight slamming against the wood. The baby screamed, burying his face in his mother's neck. The shepherd stood between them and the door, teeth bared, a growl rumbling low in his chest. The door cracked. Snow whirled in through the splintered frame. The mother backed into the corner, pressing herself against the wall, whispering prayers she could barely hear over the baby's cries. And then the door gave way. 3 wolves spilled into the room, eyes glowing in the firelight, fur bristling, jaws snapping. The shepherd lunged before they could advance, colliding with the first wolf in a tangle of fur and teeth. The two crashed into the table, sending dishes flying, the baby's food splattering across the floor. The second wolf darted past, eyes fixed on the mother and child. She screamed, clutching the baby tighter, pressing herself deeper into the corner. But the shepherd, even locked in battle, saw. With a twist of his body, he threw the first wolf aside and hurled himself between the mother and the intruder. His body slammed into the animal, driving it back toward the fire. Flames roared, smoke curling as the wolf yelped, singed, retreating. The third wolf circled, teeth flashing, testing for weakness. The shepherd stood his ground, chest heaving, fur torn and bloodied. His eyes blazed with defiance. He was old, scarred, weary. But in that moment, he was more than a dog. He was a guardian, a lifeline, an unyielding force that would not let death claim what he loved. The fight raged through the small cottage. Snarls, screams, the crackle of fire, the crash of overturned furniture. It was chaos incarnate. The mother sobbed, clutching her child, whispering, "Please, please, please," as though her words could shield them. At last, the father burst through the front door, snow swirling in behind him. He froze at the sight. Wolves scattering at his arrival. The shepherd standing bloodied in the center of the room, his body shielding his family. The wolves fled into the storm, their howls fading into the distance. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the baby's sobs and the crackling fire. The father dropped to his knees beside the shepherd, hands trembling as he felt along his ribs. Blood matted his fur, fresh wounds layered over old scars. But his eyes, those eyes, remained fixed on the baby, refusing to close until he was certain the child was safe. The baby reached out from his mother's arms, placing his tiny hand on the shepherd's muzzle. The dog's tail moved once, faint but sure. The father's voice cracked. "You're more than just a dog. You're our protector, our family, our everything." That night, as the storm raged outside, the family huddled together by the fire. The shepherd lay beside the crib, his breathing shallow but steady, the baby's small hand resting against his paw even in sleep. The trial had nearly broken him, but he had endured. Once again, he had proven the depth of his love. The kind of love that did not calculate cost. That gave everything without hesitation. And though his body bore the weight of sacrifice, his spirit stood taller than ever. For in the eyes of that baby, in the trembling hands of the parents who wept gratitude into his fur, he knew his purpose was fulfilled, his bond eternal. This was his final trial, and he had met it with the strength of 1,000 lifetimes. Morning came slowly, gray light pushing through the cracks of the boarded-up cottage. The storm had calmed, leaving behind a world blanketed in deep, untouched snow. The chaos of the night before lingered in overturned chairs, claw marks across the wooden door, and dark stains that no one dared look at too long. But within those battered walls, there was peace. The baby woke first. He stirred in his crib, small fingers clutching the shepherd's ear, where he had fallen asleep against the dog's flank. When his eyes opened, the first thing he saw was the familiar rise and fall of that chest. His laugh, innocent, bright, rang out across the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. The mother stirred next, her hair tangled, eyes swollen from tears. She blinked at the sound of her child, then turned to the shepherd, still lying where he had collapsed after the battle. Fear pinched her features, but then she saw the slow lift of his head, the flick of his tail. Relief washed over her so powerfully she fell to her knees, pressing her forehead against his. "You made it," she whispered. "You stubborn, beautiful boy. You made it." The father returned from outside carrying wood for the fire. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of exhaustion. But when he saw his wife and child wrapped around the shepherd, he let the wood clatter to the floor and crossed the room to join them. He placed his hand on the dog's scarred back, his voice hoarse. "You saved them," he said. "Again. I don't know what we'd be without you." The shepherd closed his eyes briefly, as though acknowledging the words, before shifting his weight to nuzzle the baby. His body was battered, but his spirit was unshaken. Over the days that followed, the little family built their lives anew in the cottage. The father repaired the door with his own hands, leaving the claw marks untouched, a reminder of what had been faced and survived. The mother found herself humming more, her voice softer, stronger. And the baby, now toddling with more confidence, learned quickly that his world was always anchored by the steady shadow of his guardian. The shepherd healed slowly. His wounds closed, but he walked with a heavier limp now. The vet warned that age and scars were catching up to him. Still, he never once faltered in his watch. At night, he curled beneath the crib. By day, he followed the baby from room to room, tolerating sticky fingers in his fur, pulling at his tail, even the clumsy attempts at hugs that nearly toppled them both. The bond between them had deepened into something almost wordless. The baby, too young to understand words like loyalty or sacrifice, seemed to carry them in his bones. He treated the shepherd not as a pet, but as an older brother, a constant, living piece of his heart. Winter stretched long, but eventually the thaw came. Snow gave way to streams trickling down hillsides, buds appearing on skeletal branches. Life returned to the world outside. And with spring came the chance to breathe again, to walk farther, to step into sunlight without fear. The family would often wander into the fields together. The baby toddling ahead, the parents following, the shepherd always circling to keep them close. Sometimes, when the wind brushed the grass just right, the parents would exchange glances, silently remembering all the ways fate had tested them, and all the ways this scarred German shepherd had stood between them and ruin. Neighbors began to visit, and bringing casseroles and offers of help. Word of the fire and the wolves had spread through town. People marveled at the shepherd's courage, calling him a hero. But to the family, he was not a tale to be told around firesides. He was their home, their anchor, their living miracle. The father once joked that they should build him a throne. The mother only smiled, tears in her eyes, and said, "He doesn't need one. His throne is right here, inside our hearts." One evening, when the sun painted the sky in pinks and golds, the baby, now steady on his feet, wandered toward the edge of the yard. The shepherd followed, keeping pace, ready to guide him back if he strayed too far. The boy turned, giggling, and threw his arms around the dog's neck. The parents watched from the porch, their hands entwined. The father spoke quietly. "Do you think he knows?" The mother tilted her head. "Knows what?" "That he's not just protecting us anymore. He's raising him. Teaching him what it means to be brave. To love without question." She smiled faintly. "Yes, I think he knows." And in that moment, as the baby leaned his head against the shepherd's fur, it was clear the bond was not one-sided. The child gave the dog as much as he received. A reason to fight, to endure, to stay. Time moved forward, as it always does. Seasons shifted. The cottage grew warmer, more lived in. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer bled. They were stories etched into walls, into hearts, into fur. The shepherd aged. His muzzle grew grayer, his steps slower. But the love that burned in him never dimmed. When he lay in the grass watching the boy play, eyes half closed, it was with a peace he had never known before. For a creature once left starving, tied to a fence, abandoned by the world, he had found a place where he was not only wanted but needed, cherished, and adored. And so, in the final quiet years of his life, he rested in the warmth of family, not as a forgotten stray, but as a legend written into the marrow of their days. Because in the end, the shepherd's greatest victory was not in the battles he fought, but in the love he left behind. A love that would echo through the boy's laughter, through the parents' memories, through every soul that ever heard his story. Years passed the way rivers carve valleys, slowly, almost unnoticed, until one day the landscape is forever changed. The boy was no longer a boy. He had grown tall, his voice deep, his steps steady. Yet in every room he walked into, in every decision he made, there was an echo of the German shepherd, who once guarded his first breaths of life. The dog was gone now. His last years had been gentle, softened by love, warmed by firesides, surrounded by the ladder of the family he had saved. When his time came, it was not with fear, but with the quiet dignity of a soul who knew he had given everything. They had buried him beneath the old oak tree in the meadow, the place where the boy had once wrapped tiny arms around his neck. The earth above him bloomed with wildflowers each spring. The boy, now a man, still visited often. He would kneel before the weathered stone the family had placed there, his fingers brushing the carved name simply etched guardian. Because that was what he had been, more than a dog, more than a companion. He had been the living thread that stitched together a fragile family, and pulled them through fire, fear, and loss. On the day the man's first child was born, he held the baby in trembling arms and felt, for a heartbeat, that same protective weight the shepherd had once carried for him. He looked down into the wide, searching eyes of his daughter and whispered, "You're safe. Always safe." And in that whisper, he heard an echo, the low growl of warning, the steady thump of a tail, the soft sigh of a dog who had once kept him safe in a burning world. When he brought his daughter home, the house felt incomplete without the soft shuffle of paws on wood. He placed a framed photograph on the mantel. The shepherd sitting in the grass, muzzle gray, eyes gentle, the boy, still small then, hugging him tightly. The picture became a beacon, a story he would tell over and over. "See that dog?" he would tell his daughter as she grew. "He saved me before I even knew what saving meant. He gave me courage before I knew the word. Everything I am today, everything you see in May, I learned from him." The mother and father had grown old too. Their hair silvered, their hands slower, but their memories sharp when it came to the shepherd. Sometimes, at family dinners, they would fall into quiet silence, their gazes meeting across the table, both remembering the night of fire and wolves, the storm that nearly ended them all. And then one of them would smile and say, "Remember how he stood in front of us? How he didn't hesitate." The other would nod, eyes misty. "I'll never forget. He was braver than anyone I've ever known." The years rolled forward. The man's daughter grew into her own laughter, her own toddling steps, her own adventures in the fields behind the house. And always, her father told her stories of the shepherd, not to make her sad, but to give her roots, to show her the shape of love and loyalty. "Why do you miss him so much?" she asked once, tilting her head the way children do when they search for truths bigger than themselves. The man crouched beside her, his voice breaking slightly as he answered, "Because he taught me the greatest lesson of all. That love isn't just a word. It's a choice you make every single day, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." The girl nodded slowly, as if she understood, though she was too young to carry the full weight of it. But years later, when she too grew and faced her own storms, those words would return to her, steady and true, like paw prints leading her home. On the 20th anniversary of the shepherd's passing, the family gathered by the oak tree. The meadow was golden with tall grass, bees humming lazily in the summer air. The stone was nearly hidden by vines now, but the man cleared them away gently, laying fresh flowers over the mound. His daughter, now older, knelt beside him. "I wish I could have met him," she whispered. "You did," he said softly, surprising her. Her brow furrowed. "How?" "Because he lives in me. In every story I've told you, in every lesson I've tried to teach, in the way I hold you close when storms come. That's him. You've carried him all along." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not sad tears. They were the kind that come when love stretches so far across time that it feels unbreakable. The wind rustled the oak's branches, leaves whispering like voices of the past. For a moment, they could almost hear it. The steady patting of paws through grass, the soft exhale of a guardian resting beside them. That night, the man sat alone by the fireplace, the house quiet. He reached for an old leather collar kept in a drawer, worn smooth from years of use. He held it in his lap, his thumb tracing the marks, and closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered into the silence. And in the stillness, he felt it again. Not in sound, not in sight, but in the marrow of his being. The presence of a dog who had once stood against fire, against hunger, against fear, to guard the life of a boy who would grow into a man, a father, a storyteller. Because in the end, the shepherd's legacy was not the battles he had fought, nor the dangers he had braved. His true legacy was love, the kind that planted itself in a child's heart and grew into a forest that would shelter generations. And though paws no longer walked the halls, and the weight of him no longer pressed at the foot of the bed, the echo of his love would never fade. It lived in laughter, in courage, in quiet moments of tenderness passed down like a torch. Love like that doesn't end. It becomes eternal, it becomes the lifeline.